Hey everyone, have you ever been watching the news and just wondered, why this story? Why now? Why are some huge events front page news for weeks while others just disappear? Well, today we're going to dig into a really fascinating framework that tries to answer exactly that.
Okay, so let's start with a little thought experiment. Picture two different tragedies happening somewhere in the world. Why does it feel like sometimes the media coverage for one is just wall to wall, full of outrage, while for the other, which might be just as bad or even worse, we get crickets, almost complete silence?
And this isn't just a feeling. The source material for this explainer actually has some pretty startling data to back this up. Check out this table. In the 90s, the word genocide was used 220 times when talking about Serbian actions in Kosovo, who were, at the time, a U.S. enemy. For Iraq and the Kurds, another enemy, 132 times. But then, look at U.S. allies. For Indonesia in East Timor, just 33 mentions. And for Turkey's actions against the Kurds, only 14. Now, the authors point out that the human cost in those last two cases was just as devastating, if not more so.
Right. So that's the big question, isn't it? Why is there such a huge difference? Is this all just some random coincidence, or is there something structural, something deeper, going on with how our media works?
Well, one very influential, and pretty controversial, answer comes from a framework called the propaganda model, first laid out by Edward Herman and Noam Chomsky.
Now, it's super important to get what this model is and what it isn't. This is not some conspiracy theory. There's no secret backroom where editors are getting phone calls with their marching orders. Nope. It's an analysis of institutional pressures. The argument is that the very way our media is built, who owns it, how it makes money, just naturally leads to a certain kind of reporting that tends to support the powerful. It's more about hiring the right people and having them internalize what's important.
So how exactly do these pressures work? Well, the model breaks it all down into what it calls 5 filters. Think of it like a series of sieves that every potential news story has to pass through before it ever gets to you.
Okay, let's run through them. First up, you've got ownership. Media outlets today are gigantic corporations, owned by even bigger conglomerates. Their number one job, make a profit. Second, advertising. This is the big one. Ads are the main source of cash, so you can't produce content that's going to seriously upset your advertisers. Third is sourcing. Reporters need a constant, reliable flow of news, so they naturally turn to official sources, government press briefings, corporate PR, you get the idea. The fourth filter is flack. This is basically organized pushback. Think angry letters, lawsuits, or advertiser boycotts that come down on any outlet that steps too far out of line. And finally, number 5 is ideology. This is like the air everyone breathes, a shared set of beliefs, like a deep faith in the free market that frames how every single story is understood and told.
So that's the theory in a nutshell. But does it actually play out in the real world? The authors give a ton of case studies to show how this model works in practice.
Let's look at election coverage back in the 1980s. When El Salvador, a U.S. ally, had an election, it was framed as this hopeful step toward democracy. Any violence or flaws, mostly downplayed. But at the same time, when Nicaragua, a U.S. opponent, had an election, it was widely called a sham, and every little flaw was put under a microscope. The authors argue it's like the media was using two totally different rulebooks, and those rulebooks just happened to perfectly align with U.S. foreign policy.
And we see this same pattern, the authors argue, when you look at how massacres were covered. In 1999, when Serbian forces, a U.S. enemy, killed Albanians at Racak, it was called an intolerable massacre that was used to justify a NATO bombing campaign. But just a few months later, an even bigger massacre happened in Likuika, East Timor, carried out by the Indonesian military, a U.S. ally. That one got way less coverage, the language was much more muted, and it certainly didn't lead to calls to challenge U.S. policy.
In fact, if you look at the actual numbers from the source, it's pretty wild. For a full year after these events, the Racak massacre was mentioned in the media over 4 times more often than the Likuika massacre.
And this quote really gets to the core of the model's explanation. This isn't just happening by accident. The argument is that this selective focus creates what the authors call worthy victims and unworthy victims. When you shine a massive spotlight on the victims of your enemies, it makes those enemies look pure evil. But when you ignore the victims of your own actions or your allies' actions, those policies can just keep on going without any public backlash.
This whole idea applies to the bad guys, too. It creates a difference between worthy and unworthy victimizers. Pol Pot in Cambodia, an official enemy. He was called crazed, a mass murderer, his crimes genocide. But then you have Suharto of Indonesia, a key U.S. ally for decades. His mass killings were often talked about in a passive way, or justified as being necessary for stability and economic growth. You can see how the language itself gets filtered.
Okay, so you might be thinking, this model was developed decades ago. Does it really apply to today's world with the internet, social media, a 24-hour news cycle? It's a totally fair question.
Well, the authors argue that the trends they identified have actually gotten stronger. They point to the fact that media ownership is more centralized than ever. Today, just 9 giant transnational conglomerates dominate pretty much the entire global media system. Back in the 80s, that number was around 50. So that first filter, ownership, they'd say is stronger than ever.
But what about the internet, you might ask? And the source definitely acknowledges it's a double-edged sword. On one hand, yeah, it's an amazing tool for activists and protesters to organize and get their message out, to counter the mainstream story. But there are big limitations. It's not really a tool for mass communication unless you already have a big brand or a ton of money. Plus, the internet is rapidly being commercialized and consolidated by the same big players, facing the exact same pressures as old media.
And this quote from the source really nails that point. As the big media companies stormed the internet, the authors argue their main goal wasn't to create better journalism. It was to use this new platform for e-commerce, for advertising, basically to reinforce the same old filters, just in a new space.
So what's the end result of all this? The authors argue it's a weakening of the public sphere. Now that's just a fancy term for the spaces, real or virtual, where we're all supposed to come together and debate the important issues facing our democracy. The argument is that the constant push for profit, for entertainment, for consumerism, it just shoves all that serious political talk to the side.
All of which leaves us with a really important question to chew on. If the news we get every day really is shaped by these powerful and often invisible filters, what does that mean for us? How do we break out of that? How can we become more critical, more informed consumers of information? Definitely something to think about next time you turn on the news.